boys and girls, it's Mrs. Knerr. I hope everybody's doing well. I miss seeing you every day. But I'm going to try something new today. I am obviously videotaping myself with the help of my son Noah because he knows all of this video stuff. So I have to say thank you, Noah, for helping me do this because I would have no idea how to upload it to YouTube or whatever else these crazy things are with technology. So what I'd like to do today is let's refresh our memories, and I'm going to read some Chocolate Fever. Now, yesterday your assignment was, or 2 days ago, your assignment was to write 3 or 4 or 5 sentences about anything that you could remember so far. I think when we were in school together, we read at least the first 4 chapters. So that's what I'm going to do today. The only thing that you have to do is sit back and get comfortable and listen to the story. I'm sitting here comfortably on my bed. So let's begin. All right, Chocolate Fever. Chapter 1 is called Meet Henry Green. There are some people who say that Henry Green wasn't really born, but hatched, fully grown from a chocolate bean. Can you believe that? Anyway, this particular Henry Green we are speaking of was really born, not hatched, and he had a wonderful mom and a wonderful dad. His father was tall and lean and wore eyeglasses, except when he was sleeping or in the shower. Mama Green, whose name was Enid, was a short, slim woman with blue-gray eyes and a tiny mouth that always seemed to be on the verge of a smile. They all lived in an apartment in the middle of the city, along with Henry's older brother and sister. Mark Green was tall and 10 years old, and he was very good to Henry, except when they would argue, which was often. And then he would hit Henry on the head with something that was handy, which sometimes was pretty hard. But mostly Mark was fun to be with, and only got angry when Henry called him Marco, Polo. Mark didn't like that, and who could blame him? Henry's sister was very, very old, almost 14. She didn't ever argue with Henry or Mark. In fact, she hardly talked to them at all because she was so old and wise, and she was almost grown up. Her name was Elizabeth. The other morning, which was a school day at the end of the week called Friday, Henry, Mark, and Elizabeth were at the table in the dining room having breakfast. Mark was eating fried eggs. Elizabeth was chewing quietly on her usual breakfast of buttery toast and milk. And Henry was midway through his usual breakfast too. Chocolate cake, a bowl of Cocoa Crispy cereal, and of course the milk had more chocolate syrup in it to make it even more chocolatey. He washed it down by a big glass of chocolate milk and 5 or 6 chocolate chip cookies. Sometimes, when it was left over from the night before, Henry would have chocolate pudding too. And on Sunday mornings, he usually had chocolate ice cream. The truth was that Henry was in love with chocolate, and chocolate seemed to love him too. It didn't make him fat. In fact, he was a little on the thin side. It didn't harm his teeth. He had never had a cavity in his life. It didn't stunt his growth. He was just about average height, perhaps even a little bit tall for his age. It didn't harm his skin, which had always been clear and fair. But most of all, it never gave him a bellyache. And so his parents, perhaps being not as wise as they were kind, they let Henry have as much chocolate as he liked. Can you imagine a boy having a chocolate bar sandwich as an after-school snack? Well, Henry did, just about every day. And when he ate mashed potatoes, just a few drops of chocolate syrup was swirled into them to make them taste a lot better. Chocolate sprinkles were sprinkled on top of plain butter noodles. They were tasty too. Not to mention a light dusting of cocoa on things like peaches, pears, and applesauce. In the Greens' kitchen pantry, there was always a giant supply of chocolate cookies, chocolate cakes, chocolate pies, and chocolate candies of every kind. There was ice cream too. Chocolate, of course. Chocolate nut, chocolate fudge, chocolate marshmallow, chocolate swirl, and especially chocolate almond crunch. And all of it was just for Henry. If there was one thing you could say about Henry, it was that he surely did love chocolate. Probably more than any boy in the history of the world, his mother would say. How does Henry like his chocolate? Daddy Green would sometimes joke. Why, he likes it bitter. He likes it sweet. He likes it light. He likes it dark. And he likes it daily. And it was true up until the day we're talking about right now. Chapter 2 is called A Strange Feeling. Better hurry, kids, Ma Green called from the kitchen. It's almost 8:30. Let's go, Slowpoke, Mark said to Henry. We don't want to be late. Just one more chocolate cookie, said Henry. He popped it in his mouth. Still chewing, he went into his room and he got his books. On the way to the front door, Henry went through the kitchen and gathered a handful of chocolate kisses to put into his pocket. He liked to have them handy to munch on at school. But this morning, because he still felt somewhat hungry, Henry ripped the silver wrapping from 2 kisses and popped them into his mouth. Then, after a quick kiss for Mama Green, a kiss that left a little bit of chocolate on her face, Henry, Elizabeth, and Mark headed out the door on their way to school. At the corner, Henry and Mark waved goodbye to their sister, who had to take a bus to get to her high school. The boys' school, PS 123, was just another block away. At the next corner, Mrs. McIntosh, the crossing guard, she waved them across the street and said, "The light is always green for the Greens." She said that in her own little joke. And she said it just about every morning. This morning, only Mark, who was extremely polite, he smiled. Henry didn't feel like smiling. In fact, he was beginning to feel a little bit strange. In the schoolyard, the boys went separate ways to join their classes. As usual, there was a lot of pushing and shoving and fooling around. But Henry, who was always very good at things like knocking hats off boys' heads and making goofy faces at the girls, was quiet. He didn't even say hi when Michael Burke, his best friend, came along. "Well, what's the matter with you?" asked Michael. "What do you mean, what's the matter?" Henry said. "Can't I just stand here? Do I have to carry on and behave like a nut?" Okay, said Michael. "You don't have to bite my head off. It's just like you're kind of different today, not like you at all." Just then the whistle blew and all the children began marching into the school building. "I feel funny today," Henry said to Michael. "I have the feeling something's going to happen, but I just don't know what." That exact feeling that something was going to happen stayed with Henry all morning. He felt strange in his home room. He felt strange when he went to gym class. And in Mrs. Kimmelfarber's math class, he felt strange all over. Henry couldn't concentrate on what Mrs. Kimmelfarber was saying. He just sort of sat there and stared. Without thinking about it, he was looking at his arm and the back of his hand. And then he noticed something. There were little brown freckles all over his skin. Now, this would not have been such a startling discovery except for one thing. Those little brown freckles were not there this morning. At the front of the room, Mrs. Kimmelfarber was going through the drills on fractions. She was saying, "And if I take 6 1/2 and subtract 1 1/4, what will I have left?" She looked directly at Henry, who was looking directly at his arm. She said, "Henry, what will I have left?" And Henry said, "Little brown spots all over." And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called Mrs. Kimmelfarber's problem. There was silence in the room for about 2 seconds. Then there was a riot. All the girls began to giggle, but the boys, they chuckled and laughed right out loud. Henry turned red, and Mrs. Kimmelfarber, who did not appreciate the humor at all, turned white. She rapped her ruler against the desk and shouted for silence. Henry Green, she said, "What is the meaning?" He said, "Little brown spots all over. I was looking at my arm and I have these." "Little brown spots all over," she said. "I heard you quite clearly." "But you see, Mrs. Kimmelfarber, I didn't have them all my life. I didn't even have them this morning, but now..." "I know," she said. "Now you have them all over. I'd better take a look." She took Henry and she led him over by the window. She said. "Looks like freckles to me." "No, ma'am," said Henry, "it just can't be." "Why not?" asked Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Because I have very clear and delicate skin, like my mother." "Oh," she said, "and who told you that?" Henry said, "My father." Said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Now, are you sure you didn't observe this phenomenon before this morning?" "If that means, did I see them?" Henry said. "No, I didn't." "Well then, you, Henry Green, you stand right where you are." And then she said to her class, "Continue to read your books until I return, and please read in silence." Henry stood as told while the class looked at him. Mrs. Kimmelfarber walked a few steps down the hall to Mr. Pangalis's room. She looked through the doorway and waited until he glanced in her direction. Catching his eye, she waved him out into the hallway. She said, "Listen, Phil, I want you to take a look at a kid." He said, "For heaven's sakes, Dolores, you got me out of class for this?" She said, "Well, he has little brown spots all over his arm." "Little brown spots? You got me out of class for little brown spots?" "I thought maybe the measles." "Oh, no," said Mr. Pangalis. "Or chicken pox?" He said, "I'd better take a look." The two of them turned Henry to the light near the window, right in the corner where the potted plants were growing. Mr. Pangalis poked and prodded, and even took his eyeglasses out of his pocket and put them on. He said, "Freckles. They're just freckles." "Are you sure?" Mr. Pangalis's round nose twitched, and he sniffed the air. "Chocolate?" he said. "Have they brought the chocolate milk upstairs already?" "Oh, forget the milk," she said. "Look, now he has them on his face." "Oh, no," said Henry. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Oh, my," said Mr. Pangalis. "And they weren't there before?" "No. 2 minutes ago that boy's face was as clear as day, and now..." Henry felt as if his heart were about to drop into his shoes. He swallowed hard and stared at the two teachers, who were staring at his face. "Little brown spots all over," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "And I see more of them coming out as we speak." A tear, just one, welled up in Henry's right eye and began to trickle down his cheek, running in between all of the little brown spots. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is called Pop. "Dirt breeds germs," Nurse Molly Farthing would often say, "and germs have a nasty way of making healthy people ill." Naturally, the infirmary of PS 123 was always spotless, because Nurse Molly Farthing wouldn't have it any other way. And naturally, as Mrs. Kimmelfarber and Henry rushed through the door that morning, she made them go back and wipe their feet on the mat. "And don't bring any of your cocoa in here," she said. And she sniffed the air. "Cocoa?" said Mrs. Kimball-Farber. Nurse Molly said, "Don't think that I don't smell it." "Please, Nurse Molly," said Mrs. Kimball-Farber, "we have an emergency on our hands. This is Henry Green, and he's breaking out in some sort of rash." "So I see," she said. She sat Henry down in a chair and turned on a bright light. Pushing her spectacles down to the tip of her nose, she bent close to Henry and looked him over. She said, "It's a rash, all right. Looks peculiar. Looks like little brown spots all over." Then she asked Henry, "Have you ever had measles?" "Yes," he said, "when I was 5. "Chicken pox?" "When I was 3.5. "Then I would say that you have an unidentified rash, and frankly, I don't like the look of it." Henry, who was up until now, he was merely frightened. Now he began to feel terrified. Nurse Molly laid her cool hand on his arm and steadied him. There, dear," she said. "Nothing to be frightened of. I'm sure it's not serious. How do you feel?" "Not very good," said Henry. "Are you warm?" "No." "Cold?" "No." "Dizzy?" "No. I just feel strange." "You poor dear," said Nurse Molly. "You must really be frightened." She ran her fingers through his hair and patted the back of Henry's neck. Somehow this made him feel a little bit better. "Pop!" "Did you say something?" asked Nurse Molly. "No, ma'am," said Henry. "Pop!" "What is that noise then?" "It sounded like something going pop." "I heard it too," said Henry. "So did I," said Mrs. Kimball-Farber. "Pop, pop, pop." Now they all heard it. The sound of popping filled the infirmary. Little pops and bigger pops and poppity-pop pops kept popping. Henry looked at his arm and in an instant knew where the noises were coming from. His little brown spots were growing bigger and bigger. They were popping all out of him. No longer were they the size of freckles. They were now as big as chocolate chips that his mother used for baking cakes and cookies. He could feel them popping out under his arms and all over his face, and he could feel them growing under his shirt. In less time than it takes to tell, Henry Green was covered with little brown lumps from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. And that is where we're going to end for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you remembered some things that happened in chapters 1 through 4. And I'll continue to read more next week. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.